What's up, guys? Steven Spikes here at the Spike Signal, and today I'm going to go ahead and talk about another Omnium Gatherum song. This time it's going to be Ego off of the album New World Shadows. Going to be talking about some of the things to make the song sound so interesting and fun. It's coming up right now here on the Spike Signal. So when I initially chose this song for an analysis, I more or less just picked it because it's just a really fun and cool sounding song, and I associate a lot of good memories with it and everything like that. So I wanted to go ahead and look at it for that reason, but as I got into it, I realized that there was a lot of great subtle things done in it to provide excellent opportunity to discuss some interesting concepts and ideas when it comes to songwriting for metal. So without waiting for it, let's get into it right now. As always, I have notated the implied chords, or what I interpret to be the implied chords anyways, right up top here in the bass line. I have the guitars shown here, and here with those I left the accompanying tabs in just for anyone that wanted to see actually where we'd be at in terms of the tabbing. And this is an additional guitar shown right here. There's nothing in it right here at the beginning, but it will come in. This right here is the drum line, and these right here are, or what will be filled with, the pads. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to go ahead and play it right from the start. But before I do, wanted to say this song is in C sharp standard tuning. So we're quite a bit down and everything like that. There's going to be some interesting key changes, but for right now we're here. We therefore are in the key of C sharp minor for the time being. That'll change, but we'll get onto that when it comes and everything. So I'm just going to go ahead and play this first part, and let's talk about how the song begins. Okay, so right off the bat, the song has a very I'd call it like metalcore type sound. We have a lot of use of pedal tones, similar to what we've seen in songs like 2 Weeks and The Silent Divide, and we're essentially just jumping back and forth between those and melody notes, as well as switching up the pedal tones every once in a while. So I have interpreted implied chords like I typically do from the bass line right here. So let's just go ahead and take a quick look at what the movements themselves are. We start at the C minor, staying just a moment and moving up to the D sharp, what would be a D sharp diminished. It's essentially the 2 of the C sharp minor scale, moving to the flat 3, which is essentially the major chord. Back to the C sharp minor. And on the second time around, it actually moves from the E, which is the flat 3, up to, just for about a measure and a quarter, F sharp minor, which is the flat 4. Beyond that, we then get into a separate part where the lead line comes in. But let's go back and talk a little bit more about that initial riff. So what Omnium Gatherum is doing here in terms of the melody notes, I'm going to call them essentially the non-pedal tones. We have, for example, this E right here, this note right here, this other E, and so on like that. What they're doing there is basically outlining similar interval movements. If you can see right here in this section, we are in C sharp minor implication to about here. What they're doing within that is jumping back and forth between the flat 3 as a melody note, and I'm going to zoom in here really clearly so we can see this, to a 1, which is the pedal tones, of course, up to a 5, and basically just repeating those sorts of movements back and forth until doing something similar right here on the D sharp diminished. And by similar, I mean we use a flat 3, we do use a flat 6 instead. But then doing the same kind of thing very specifically when we get to this E right here, and that has a flat 3 on it. So if we see here, this is an E sort of implication all the way up to here. They are hitting, once again, that, I'm going to say a third, and that 5th over and over again. So even within separate chords, you have very similar interval movements. And like I've said in many kinds of songs, this is one thing you can do to make your song sound very cohesive, put together, and in unity with itself. And also just really cool. I mean, they're essentially like just taking the same idea and applying it to different spots in the scale, but it sounds awesome. Nothing about it sounds formulaic or generic at all. It all sounds really, really sick. So this is a great application of similarity, while at the same time just giving you a final product that sounds sick. So good stuff there. We're going to keep on going here. Now in this little change right here, this right here is kind of like the second time they repeat the main riff. It goes from that flat 3 to that 4. When they hit the 4, they do the same kind of thing more or less. You have a flat 3 here, and you have a 5. Very rhythmically similar, very in terms of interval jumping similar, even though the underlying chord implication is changing. They have a couple other things in here too, just to kind of transition to the next part. But overall, we have some very, very similar stuff happening. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look down, see what else is going on here. So the drums are doing a very kind of prototypical melodic death metal rhythm here. I call it just, it's a punk rhythm. It's basically where the 1 is a kick and the, well, the end notes, if you would, in eighth notes are snares, like so. You know, I call it a punk type riff because when I first heard that thing, it was like typically in punk, but you know, obviously melodic death metal, they use it a ton too, and it sounds super, super great. And you know, other bands like Metallica use it sometimes too, but with melodic death metal, I feel it's very, very present, especially in bands like Omnium Gatherum and Kalma and so on like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and zoom out a little bit here. Let's see what comes next. Zoom way out, in fact. So what they're doing this whole time, they're still just kind of going back and forth between that 3rd and that 5th, and that is the main riff, and it sounds good at the same time. Okay. Now we go ahead and get into what in this tab is actually labeled as the main riff itself, which is essentially the portion where the solo comes in. It's honestly the line that plays through some of the chorus, if you want to also look at it that way. So like before, let's go ahead and start with what the chords are doing. So in the chorus, we start off with a C minor, and every note though, or not every note, but every measure, often you have new chord implications interjecting before that measure ends. So for example, right here, you have a C minor essentially going for, or C sharp minor rather, essentially going for 3 beats before you have the D sharp diminished kicking in on the 4th and then carrying through the next measure. So, you know, just another technique you can think about using. It's very simple, but you don't have to be relegated simply to keeping a measure for each individual chord implication. You can switch it up in interesting ways within measures to what chords are implying. So just something cool to keep in mind there. We then go on to the flat 3. As prior, kind of this ascension from the 1 to the 2 to the flat 3. Jumping up pretty quickly to the F sharp that is, and then moving forward for the first time, I believe, to the flat 6 and the flat 7. There we go. And then the new guitar comes in. So once you do that, you return to the flat 3 after going through the flat 7, return to the flat 3, then kind of end out on the 2, which gives you a little bit of a pull to continue on and to keep going. So one thing you might have actually heard there is that when the chords are being played for the D sharp diminished, they are in fact actual chords, and they sound really, really, shall we say, nice. You know, they don't sound very dissonant or like they have a ton of bite to them. And the reason that that is the case is because when they are playing the chord with the D root, and I'm going to go ahead and play that part right here now. Right there, instead of playing a 1 and a flat 5, they're actually playing a 1 and a flat 6, which essentially it just makes things sound way, way less, you know, dissonant, way less kind of grindy and bitey, and it really, really fits nicer with this kind of uplifting sound that the song has overall too. So if you find yourself in a situation where you want to ascend in each interval from the 1 of a minor scale up to the 2 and so on from there. If you don't want to get that crazy bite you get from a flat 5, what you can do is to go ahead and take the flat 6 based off of the 2. So basically going from the 2 right here and applying a flat 6 to it. And that gets you out of having to use that flat 5 because there's no perfect 5th in the scale at this portion. So what you can do there to get the sound of chord is use the flat 6 without it being all grindy, if that's the aesthetic you're going for. If you want something with bite, you're going to want to use that flat 5. But in this case, they didn't, and it sounds really good. So as this goes on right here, I put down the intervals of the sort of lead lines that are being played, if you want to call it. Over top the C sharp minor, we have the 3rd and the 5th. The D sharp diminished, we have a flat 3 and a flat 6, and so on from there. As we can see, just kind of eyeballing it, keeping in mind what chords are being implied, say right here, this E, and what notes are going on over top of it, we can see there's a healthy amount of chord tone soloing right here. We have a 3 and the 5 going on over the flat 3, which is an E. We have a flat 3 and a 5 going on over what is the F sharp minor. So not entirely chord tones, of course. We have some 2s, we have some 7s here, although that'd be like one of the main extensions, and so on like that. But sticking close to it, once again, implying a sort of cohesion and togetherness for the entire song, despite the intensity of it. Wanted to talk about the drums, actually, really quick, just in very, very basic transition. I'm going to play a few measures back from the first part of the intro riff to get into where we're at now. So at this point, the drums have actually transitioned from having the snare on the end notes and now have a snare on a 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on like that. And now the kick is actually on the end notes, if you would. And along with that snare, there's a big, super huge crash cymbal sound as well. And what that does is just give you a complete sort of epic transition from something that sounded fast and intense and powerful to something that also sounds, almost sounds like very triumphant and somewhat ethereal, I feel. This song is very powerful, very upbeat, very uplifting. And to switch up the drum lines like that, so the snare is now on 1, adding in the crash on the 1, on the 2, on the 3, on the 4, and so on like that as well, really, really hammers home the power of the riff, the lead line, everything in and of itself. So good deal right there. Let's go ahead and keep going with it. Actually need to go forward a little bit. We are right about here. I'm going to play this whole section from the beginning. Okay. So now if you can hear that, what's going on, what this tab is saying happens is that octave chords on the second time around are being, or rather not octave chords, but a lead line that is playing octave notes of the lower lead line is applied on top of it. It's a little bit difficult to hear perfectly in the song itself. Definitely sounds like it's going on. It's just not super prominent. It might not be easy to hear something like, say, like a third, but it definitely sounds to me barely like that's happening here. So what we basically have here, as opposed to the typical harmonization where we have a 1 and its third, and by 1 I mean like whatever note in the lead line is mimicked by the third of that note in a higher lead line, we simply have octaves of those notes going on over top of it. And it's even, in some ways, it's like an even more obvious choice than picking a third. But it occurred to me that, like, at least in stuff I've analyzed and stuff that I'm sure about, I don't hear it like as much as I'd figured, so it's just a really good thing to point out here. Like, don't feel pigeonholed into having to just stick with a 1 or a series of 1s and a series of their thirds on top of it. You can mix stuff up outside of just that in a lot of interesting combinations, and sometimes a very, simple thing, even more so to the third, could be great, like using an octave note on top of your lead lines. Like, that could be really cool too, and it works wonderfully in this song in a fashion that I feel it just wouldn't even have remotely the same punch rich and triumphant effect if they did use something else like a third. So this is great right here. Just wanted to say all these overall are octave notes higher. You know, nothing else was going on aside from that I saw. So that's the technique going on here. Great little bit for a different effect, and they do that over top the same chord progression. So let's just go ahead and listen from the top of where the octave lines get introduced. Okay. So then they get into the transition point to the actual verse where Juga starts screaming. So what they do here, very, very simple. They hit the 1, they hit the C sharp. What makes it sound really cool to me, there might be like a touch of whammy action going on there or something else, I'm not positive, but the drums actually do a little bit of a triplet line in the first measure right here before moving into, this is actually inaccurate in this section. They do something much more intense than this, but the drums just kind of do this little triplet thing, which provides just a very, very great kind of, I feel like a push, like it really wants to push you to that next part of the song, and it does it well. So let's go ahead and get into that next part of the song right here. Okay, so as you can hear and as you've heard in the song, this part is near identical from a standpoint of chord implications to what we heard before, so I'm not going to spend much time on that. However, obviously the rhythm is changed. So a very, very simple tactic. Essentially just cutting out that first eighth note off of some of the measures, as well as simplifying the lead line, or rather the rhythmic line, in addition to that. And it really gives you, even though it's so similar, it really, really just does change the whole feel of the song. You know, in a way, it's almost like the guitars, and I don't mean in terms of volume, but just in terms of what you're hearing, it kind of like lets you know that the guitars are going to pull back a little bit and let the vocal like take its time, because at some points, literally the guitar is stopped. It's quiet and everything like that, as well as the bass. So that's a really cool effect. It's very, very simple, but again, it's a nice thing, so there's not competition between the guitars and the vocals. And I don't even mean in the standpoint of mixing, I just mean in the standpoint of like listener attention, if that makes any sense. So good tactic right there. Gonna go down and see if the pads doing anything. They're not. Okay, let's go ahead and continue on then. So we're moving to where it'll repeat. So quite an interesting thing here that I feel I don't see very often either is near the tail end of this time around, the verse, if you want to call it, instead of waiting for part B of verse 1, let's say, they went ahead and on the last couple measures of part A of the verse, if you know what I'm saying, like verse 1 kind of can be seen as separate parts, the first 8 measures, the next 8 measures, the first 16 measures, the next 16 measures, and so on. Before they get to that next part, to that B part, right here, they actually add in some harmonized lines, and they're just the thirds. It's very simple, but the interesting thing is here is that they added them in before they get to the next portion. So that's pretty cool. They actually remove the harmonized lines directly after, so I can only assume that maybe they had harmonized lines for the whole part. That was perhaps the initial intention of it, but they decided that because the pads are going to come in right here, it just sounded a little less cluttered with them taken out. So can't say for sure exactly what the reasoning was behind that, but I can say from a standpoint of music theory and songwriting, it creates a really cool and interesting effect. It's just a little something that changes to catch your ear before you get into a second part of a verse that has more prominent changes, which involves pads coming in and things of that nature. So let's go ahead and get to the next part of the verse. Right here. Okay, now the pads come in. Notice the pads right here. Okay, so let's talk about those pads for a second. I'm going to come on back here, and we're going to go on down to the pads. Now, I basically wrote here that the pads are more or less entering, and they just kind of follow what the bass line is doing. So any chord implication that was happening with the bass line here, which we actually covered like further back near the intro line, is more or less getting followed. What's a little more interesting is just to note what notes are actually being played here, or at least what notes this tab says is being played. The pads at some parts of the song are kind of difficult to hear, except for the part directly after the solo and the very like ending riff. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and look at this, just like assuming this is 100% accurate. We have here basically a couple things going on. We have some third notes being played with the C, as well as the C down here, way down there, that's actually the C. And even further down here, the very, very bottom note, though, that would be essentially an inverted fifth. It's a perfect fourth from this standpoint, but it would be the inverted fifth. So it's basically a large, interesting way of playing a C sharp chord. That goes on. Then it moves up to a D right here momentarily with a flat 3. Once again, avoiding that flat 5. You can also play a flat 3 to avoid that flat 5 bite sound if that's not what you're going for. And then moves up here. What would be an E? I don't have too much more to talk about there. It's just, you know, kind of can keep in mind here that what they're essentially doing is outlining the chords in a few ways, the implied chords in a few ways, using essentially sort of what you might say is inversions, with this part right here being inverted. If you were to take this note and play the same note an octave higher, you'd have a perfect fifth. And these notes right here essentially also being an octave of the root, as well as a third of the root. And that's this note right here. So just a couple techniques to keep in mind that you can use in order to make sure that your keys and pads sound interesting and cool. Let's go ahead now and get on out of here and go to the next portion. Which actually, before I go on though, I do want to say, obviously the vocals aren't shown here, but in it, I actually didn't notice this till today. I mean, you feel these things, but you might not notice them in the vocal parts where he's saying, you know, will you do it, or something to that effect. He's yelling, and when they say do it, like those words, those syllables, I actually, now that I'm listening to it, like in my mixing environment, I hear that they're actually spread out. They're kind of a gang vocal that you would hear in like some, you know, I don't know, pop punk bands. It sounds different than that, obviously. But what I hear is I feel like I hear multiple voices like from the band saying do it at the same time, and they're panned out simultaneously while Juka's screaming is coming at you down the center. So unfortunately you can't hear that here, but I heard it as I was preparing for this and listening to the song. So I just wanted to point that out really quick because it is pretty tight. As well as noting that at this point, the song's a little bit interesting, and it'll get more clear as we go on. But right now, you don't exactly know what's the verse, what's the chorus, because they're right now saying, will you do it, in this section right here. At this point, they're saying the lines, will you do it, so do it, hey, will you do it, that stuff right here. When they do this, that's the lyrics, so to speak, of the verse, but it's, or rather of the chorus, but this is still one of the verses. So it's just something else. It's a simple thing. I feel like it's something else that kind of blends the song nicely together. You know, you don't quite know where you are. And I feel like in this standpoint, it's done in a good way, because right here, you're hearing the lyrics of the chorus, and later you're going to hear the lyrics of the chorus under something else, which makes it sound fresh and new and cool. So I like that quite a bit. Let's go ahead and move on from here. Okay, so gonna quickly talk about the transition we heard right here. Simple as anything to play on your actual guitar, but just from a standpoint of what's going on here, essentially they are playing a D right here, a D power chord, and that D is not in the key of C sharp minor. So you can think of it a few ways. You can think of it as them momentarily modulating to C sharp Phrygian in order to get access to that flat 2, or you can just think of them, instead of playing 0-5, it's what it would say on the tab, is they played 1, or rather not that 0-2, it'd rather be 1-3, to give you just a really powerful and intense sound. So just wanted to point that out there. Pretty cool. Okay, so then we go back into the lead line. This part continues on, and the cool thing about this is right now the vocals pull back as well, so it's still not exactly clear to you that there's going to be chorus lines going over this, that there's going to be lyrics going on over this, because the vocals cut off now, and it's just the lead guitar and everything else, but it is the chorus. It's kind of a technique used similar in a Parasite Inc. song, Armageddon, in 16:9. What they do there for the first chorus, and this one's a little bit more kind of here or there, but what they do with the first chorus is when the chorus enters, they have the lead guitar line going, but they cut off vocals entirely, so the first chorus is literally just guitar and instrumentals and everything. It's kind of what this is right here. Once again, what it does is by the time the second chorus hits, instead of being something that the listener has already heard once and perhaps getting overly habituated to, it's something that's different that can pull the listener on and keep them engaged. So good stuff right there. I'm going to go ahead and skip a little bit past the lead line we just heard it a moment ago. I'm going to play a couple measures back from the next verse, so let's do it. To transition into the first verse or to the next verse and everything, they do a little slide thing that's pretty tight. It almost sounds like a tape stop just for a moment, but I think it's just some sliding. It's all done very good and very tightly though, so always nice to have these little tricks and flares that you don't notice initially, but you do if you listen to it closely. Very cool. All right, so here I'm actually not seeing too much different whatsoever from what we had before, so let's just listen through to it. Now, one thing that'll come up in a moment. So one pretty clear thing you probably heard there easily was the fact that the verse ended so quickly. We just got out of the chorus without the vocals, and the verse ended after, what is that, perhaps 16 measures or something. It wasn't too terribly long, not nearly as long as the other ones anyways. So just another little technique, cutting down part of a verse to get to a chorus quicker with something different now, which is vocals, which we won't hear, but they're in the actual song, in order to keep the listener engaged and keep things interesting. So let's go ahead and listen to the next part. Same flat 2 to the chorus. And I actually do want to take the opportunity to talk about the pads right here in the chorus. We're going to go ahead and take a look right over here. So there are subtle pads going on throughout the chorus, but they are essentially the same sort of idea as we discussed before. Now right here, just to talk about it in general fashion, the pads are using a combination of what would essentially be considered sixes, like for example right here, and here, and so on, as well as some perfect fifths, which can be seen right here in this section. So sixes can again sort of be thought like fourths, which can kind of be thought of like perfect fifths when you invert them around. And again, when we're talking about inversions, we just mean like if you're going to take a power chord and you're going to take the root of that power chord and play it an octave higher, what you've just done is essentially inverted a power chord. So now on the guitar, you'll literally have, assuming you're in standard tuning and on like some of the lower strings, instead of having two fingers looking something like this, if that makes any sense, you'll have two fingers looking more like this, right on top of each other, if that makes any sense whatsoever. The same kind of logic applies to doing this in a fashion of keys or any other instrument. And when you invert things, even though they're inverted and they're technically different intervals, depending on what's going on underneath, those intervals can actually sound similar. Generally speaking, sevenths can sound kind of like twos, and fourths can sound like fifths. Perfect fourths and perfect fifths, that is. That's one thing we saw in All That Remains Is 2 Weeks. I did a video on that song as well. What Ollie did there when he was making those lines is using a combination of across a bass and two guitars, was using everything to outline chords in either full triads or in perfect fifths in interesting ways. Sometimes what you get when you stack the bass and the two guitars themselves are a root note, and a fifth. Sometimes it's a root note, a fifth, and a one, if that makes any kind of sense. Root, fifth, one, and everything. And what that does is essentially just really, even though you're implying something that's typical, implying a movement that might be very commonplace, like going from the 6 to the 1 to the flat 6 and so on like that and everything. What you're getting out of that is different because it has different interval inversions, so to speak. So pretty good stuff right there, and that's what these keys are doing. Sometimes they're just playing straight perfect fifths, again, assuming all this tab is correct. And sometimes they're playing sixth, as shown, say, right here. At other points as we go on, and I'll play this right now, according to the tab, they're doing some standard thirds as well, with a note way, way down there, kind of like in sub-territories. Of course, that's hard to hear. So all this to say, if you had to take something away from this, what I'm basically getting out here is don't be afraid of doing inversions on your keys and even on your guitars too, even though we see that stuff not happening quite as much here. In some cases, it happens all over the place in other sessions, so in other senses. So don't be afraid to do that. It can give you really, really cool effects. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to move on forward now to the next chorus, which is right here. Okay, so at this point we get into something a little bit different now. So we have another sort of slide out transition right here. And what is important to me is the key modulation, because we do have a key modulation. We actually move to the key of B minor. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different here and actually pull this over right here. This is the circle of fifths. It's basically how you keep track of where you're at when in terms of keys and such like that. So this whole song thus far, we've been in the key of C sharp minor. The greens, as you can see right here, I'll even zoom in a touch if I can. Maybe I can't. Oh, there we go. The minors are right here. Those are the green ones. We've been in C sharp minor this whole time. Now we now have moved to the key, and I'm going to go back to the key of B minor, as can be seen right here. There's two sharps. So what we've done here is, if you want to talk about in a certain term, is we've modulated a major second down. On the guitar, you would literally move the whole the pattern, or all the patterns you're playing, down 2 frets, and you would be now in the key of B minor. And that's where this next part of the riff is going to take place in, and there's going to be some more shifting around too. We'll see that in a moment. So let's go ahead and play it. All these notes are kind of revolving around the B minor, just a nice little riff. Okay, and now we're back home. We're back in C sharp minor, which is where most of the song to this point has taken place. And so that now means we've essentially moved from B minor to C sharp minor. We've stepped over F sharp. So we're moving around the circle of fifths, not in like perfect increments. We've stepped over via a major second to C sharp minor. And for general information, the closer you stay on the circle of fifths to a key while you're moving around it, for example, going from E to B to F sharp, that's going to sound way more consistent and less jarring than, say, going from like F sharp to C minor, F sharp minor to C minor. That'll sound super, super jarring because it's on the other side of the circle of fifths entirely. So just something general to keep in mind there. Go ahead and play this. Now, again, we're in C sharp minor. Same thing, kind of revolving around the C sharp. Exact same passage, exact same intervals, best I can tell, except for being in a different key. And that brings to light something very important here. This song does something really cool, which I don't hear that frequently in melodic death metal, and perhaps as I analyze more of these songs, I'll see it more, but I haven't been able to pick it out yet. What it does is essentially, and when I say copy and paste, I don't mean this in a bad way, but it replicates, let's say it duplicates, exact same interval movements within keys to different keys in order to create variation. In lots of songs, we see variation created via transitioning from one chord to another. Like just back here, we're transitioning from, say, the E right here up to the F, which is right here, and that creates movement in and of itself. A different strategy you can take is to actually, instead of that, stay more or less within the same key, or rather chord implication. Like this whole B minor part, the part that's in B minor that modulates to it, this whole section, I am interpreting all of this more or less as a B minor chord for the entire, 8 measures that it's around. I mean, B minor is the main note there. instead of changing to another chord implication within the key of B minor, you can modulate the entire key to something else, like C sharp minor. So now you basically went from a 1 to a 1. You went to the 1 of B minor, now to the 1 of C sharp minor. But even though you're still like in the 1, obviously it sounds different because you've changed the key. So it's a really, really cool technique, and quite honestly, a technique that I feel everyone should be using, myself included, if they have a song that has like quite a bit of repetition in it, because that repetition can quickly be turned into variation by doing something like this. And again, I want to stress, unless I've missed it, all the notes like right here, all these like little like melody notes, all that stuff, if I'm not mistaken, this is all like damn near identical, if not identical right here. Like all the interval distances are the same. All that matters is what key they're in. They've moved the entire pattern down, and within the pattern, even after they've moved it, all the intervals are the same. So really, really something cool to keep in mind there for songwriting. So let's go ahead and listen to the C minor part. All right. So now then the solo comes in. I'm actually going to do the solo in another video, in the next video rather, because I've found that solos can often be packed with so much stuff that giving them their own time to discuss everything in them is usually optimal. So I'm just going to go ahead and wait to talk about the solo so I can give it its full time, however much it may needed, without feeling like it's dragging on too much. I will say though, in a general sense, I'll talk about it rhythmically for a moment, the solo does go back to B minor, as we can see up top right here. And at this point also, like, just in terms of everything, I'll talk about everything during this section, the guitar's cut out entirely, so all you hear is the lead line, which is pretty cool. And on top of that, and of course, you're going to have to listen to this in the actual song because you're not going to be able to hear it on here. On top of that, I feel like there might be like a little more delay or something like that as well. Just other effects to make it sound big. So that's important as well. So let's go ahead and listen to it. Now the whole song transitions to C sharp minor. Okay. Then we finish out, the solo ends, and like I said, I'll talk about the solo much more in depth next video, but the solo ends for now, and we're still in C sharp minor. So basically, the solo started in B minor, went to C sharp minor, and now we're still in C sharp minor for this kind of interlude riff, shall we call it. And if I'm not mistaken, we have a couple things come in here that sound pretty interesting. Somewhere in one of these sections, and I can't remember exactly where it is, there is a point where lots of things kind of cut out. It might be here, it might have been back earlier in that part where the guitar is cut out entirely. You can actually hear, depending on the system you're listening to, and this is a music production thing, so you wouldn't be able to hear this on the tab, but you can actually hear that the kick itself sounds bigger, louder, that there's more reverb on it. It just sounds fatter, and I want to get better before I start commenting on exactly how they might have done that, but you can definitely tell it sounds more impactful. So another thing to keep in mind in terms of making a song interesting, use different sounds, and by sounds I mean change some of the effects on your instruments. You know, you want your kick to sound bigger, put a little bit of reverb on it at a certain point to make it sound bigger and such like that. But I'm not going to talk too much about that because I'm still learning all that, so we'll come back to that shit. But let's go ahead and get back to the music theory in this. All right. So, talking about the chords really quick, we have, similar to what we've had, C sharp minor, a 1, to a 2, to a 3, to a 2, to a flat 6, to a flat 7, to a 1, to a 4. Very, very similar, and of course I'm just kind of reading off this stuff, rather this stuff right here up top that I put in there, just kind of guiding us where we're at. This part is a little bit different, but it is following the same sort of stuff. Once again, the D, even though we have a D sharp in here, which has a flat fifth, we're not really playing the flat fifth anywhere. We're not playing the flat fifth anywhere. We are avoiding that by simply doing palm muted notes, just playing the root in and of itself. Beyond that, I wanted to discuss a little bit about the pad. Now in this section, as you can see here, I actually went ahead and I put all the notes that were being played based on the chord. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make this really clear for us. I'm going to move the implied chords down so we can see exactly what's happening here for the pads. So let's do this. Here we go. Okay, so for the C sharp minor, and these are all the same notes, I just moved them down so we can see them easier. This section right here is still what we're looking at. Okay. Right there. So we have a C sharp minor up top, and what the pads are doing for this measure up until the D sharp that we hear right here are playing basically a 1, a flat 3, and a 5, once again in a kind of interesting fashion. We have some inversions going on, we have some thirds going on, such as that, just playing the chord that's being implied by the bass and the guitars in an interesting fashion over top using pads. That's what's going on here. For the D sharp diminished, we have what is essentially the flat 6 and the 1. This right here, that upper note, that's a D sharp. This note right here would be the flat 6 of that if, you know, it was higher and everything. It's lower, but you get what I'm saying. So we then pretty much straight up have a flat, or rather a flat 3 with a 1, a 3, and a 5 over it. Very, very major sounding. It's the major note. It's the flat 3. Transitioning back, and you can see the octave chords, or rather the implied chords here as well. A with a 3, a 5, a 1, and a 3 being played there. So that's kind of an interesting setup. You have essentially underneath this A where the bass is, you know, kind of chugging along on the A and growling along on the A, and the guitars are doing an A. You have this pad over top that's playing the 3rd of an A, the 5th of an A, a 1 of an A, which is the A, and the 3rd once again. So just another interesting thing to do to make things sound cool and unique. And moving to the D. Holding up a moment as you kind of hit this stop point where things take a rest on the 4. So, and right after that, you pretty much have the pads doing the same thing. So again, all this to say, don't be afraid of using inversions in your pads. Some bands, like Buckethead, I think in particular, as an example, and All That Remains, use inversions on the regular throughout their songs. But when it comes to pads, I feel like that's something where it's even more rife with good possibilities for using inversions. So definitely don't be afraid of doing that. Let's go ahead and continue on. I'm going to go ahead and move this bass right here back up to the top so we can keep looking at stuff. You have that rest right there. All this is the same, more or less, best I can tell. Okay, then the drums change. That's the only difference here. It is a fairly significant difference in the song, though. By changing up the drums like that, you build intensity, you create movement, and you rear up for the next part, which is coming right up. And the next part is right here, but before we get into it, I just wanted to point out really quickly again, to transition to the sort of final chorus, shall we call it, we have that, that's a whammy bar effect. Didn't hear it till right now. You just have the guys hammer down on the whammy bar while playing a note, and it creates that cool little effect. You're not going to even really hear it unless you're really paying closely, but it's those little things in there that make a song sound so special. So all those little touches together really add up in the end. So do whatever you can like that. It's good stuff. I'm going to go play it a few measure back in order to get into the last chorus. Okay, and we're in a different key once again, so I haven't notated it because the intervals are identical, best I can tell. But once again, you create interest and intrigue and excitement by changing the key, not the intervals themselves. So I'm just going to go ahead and play this whole section without talking, so check it out. Okay, so what we've done here is we've once again transitioned a different key. So we were initially in the key of C sharp minor. That's where the vast majority of this song has been at. For a few points before the solo and during the solo, we moved to the key of B minor. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring back up the circle of fifths. We are now in the key, and let me double check myself right here, in the key of D sharp minor. So D sharp minor, just like what we were looking at before, is within this general vicinity of the circle of fifths. It's not too far away from C sharp minor, but instead of modulating down a major second to the key of B minor, we're now modulating up a major second to the key of D sharp minor. Don't pay attention to this E flat or this, any of this stuff right here. Some keys can be viewed from different perspectives using sharps or flats. For our purposes here, we're just going to be thinking of this as a D sharp minor key. So what that does now, and this is why I think why this part sounds so uplifting, I have found in a variety of cases in songs and honestly in backing tracks too. If you listen to guitar backing tracks on YouTube to jam to them, you probably wouldn't just listen to them, but if you're jamming to them, you'll occasionally find, there's one in particular I come across quite often, you'll find sometimes keys and backing tracks where there is a modulation upwards by a factor of major 2. And all I can say is, for me personally, I feel like that's one of the most empowering modulations you can make. When you have a home bass, like C sharp minor in this case, and you modulate up a major 2, I feel like that, to me, that's just one of the best sounding modulations you can do. It sounds powerful. It sounds triumphant. It sounds fucking sick is what it sounds like. You know what I'm saying? And that's what they do here. And they do it in the perfect fashion. They do it at the perfect time. So right now, at this point in the song, you've heard the lead guitar line about maybe 4 times. Like, you've heard it quite a bit at this point, but several of those times it's in different keys, and this time as well it's in a different key. So even though it's the exact same line, it's made interesting and cool by being in a different key, and that's the kind of stuff you want to do to keep a listener engaged. And at the same time, like we've talked about before, you keep that cohesion of a song by making the intervals within the key be exactly the same as the intervals that you were using within another key. And it's really interesting too, because we've talked before about like using diatonic stuff, just means notes within the same key, to create cohesion within a riff or within a song itself. Well, this is a situation where instead of creating cohesion by staying within the key, you're creating cohesion by moving to other keys while simultaneously keeping the same interval distance within the riff you're playing as you're moving to other keys. So it kind of flips what we talked about in the past before on our head, or on its head, but it still does it in a way where you don't sacrifice cohesion. You're not switching to D sharp minor and playing a totally different riff with like a bunch of natural sevens and stuff like that, or anything in harmonic or melodic minor scale. You're keeping everything, best I can tell anyways, everything the same, except you're changing the key. You're modulating the entire riff upwards or downwards or whatever. So great technique to use. It sounds just amazing here. This might be one of the most empowering melodic death metal songs I've ever heard outside of some of Anterior stuff. It just sounds so freaking great, and I love it. So let's go ahead and listen to it and see what else we have to talk about here. All right, so we're getting to the end of this section. Before we get there, wanted to point out again, once again, we have some gang vocals going on. You're not going to hear those in the tabs, obviously, but we have some gang vocals going on right around this general section, along with Juka's main screams. And then what do? You have another key change. You have another key change to keep things interesting and to keep things moving, this time to F sharp minor, which in this case now is right here. So what we've done from right now is we've essentially gone on a journey around the circle of fifths, or around part of it anyways. We started in C, and let me point out again before I get into this, F sharp minor, this riff, we are in F sharp minor. And where I played it in the tab, you can even hear how the key changes, because it sounds like out of tune right there where I played it, but you can hear it lift here. And the whole thing kind of lifts up, it sounds like. And it sounds freaking sick. So what we've done here, like just in terms of kind of summing up the key changes we've had here, we started the whole song in the key of C, or not the whole song, vast majority of it's in the key of C. We then moved to the key of B flat minor, right, or rather just B minor, right here. We then transitioned back to the key of C sharp. In the solo, we kind of jumped back and forth again. Then For the first part of the last chorus, we move to the key of D sharp minor. Now what we're doing is essentially modulating back around the circle of fifths, not this time via a major second, to the key of F sharp minor. And that once again just creates movement and lift and energy, and it sounds awesome. We've now heard at this point this riff, like every part of this riff, the lead line, the bass, the vocals, I mean, so to speak, because they're screamed, but the rhythm guitar, lead guitar, everything in 3 different keys. And that's why this song keeps going and keeps sounding awesome and exciting, even though they play the same thing a ton. It's because of the key changes. It's a great tactic to use. Let's go ahead and listen to nearly the whole thing again. You feel the lift, you feel the difference. They are changing other things here too, and we'll stop it in a second and talk about that. Okay, so that's where the song ends. We're not done just yet, though. Along with the key change to F sharp minor, they are also doing different things. First of all, the gang vocals do something kind of cool right here in the first measure. They're all yelling. The gang vocals kind of cut out, and Juka's voice continues on for a little bit. It's just a really, really great kind of texture, I'd call it. Everything comes at you, and it's panned in a certain way. So if you have like stereo, like whatever you're listening to is in stereo, you can hear the vocals come at you from all directions. Then Juka's is remaining, and then his kind of fades out too and everything. And then after that, the vocals are gone. So the vocals are cut out for the entire duration of this last part, kind of like it's starting or ending the song where it started, where it's just an awesome lead line with nothing else going on. Once that is done and the vocals cut out, we also have, or rather simultaneously to the first measure of this last part of the chorus, we have a pad of a different sound kicking. The pads to this point in like the first half of the song, if they're even there, because I do have a hard time hearing them personally, they're very, very quiet. There is a pad you can hear rather clearly around the interlude right after the solo. It almost sounds a little bit like a jazz organ. The keyboardist is definitely using different sounds to give a lot of interesting textures to the song. The pads here, though, and it all sounds the same on Guitar Pro, but I'm going to play it just so you can hear what the intervals sound like. In the song, the pads are much louder, much more prominent. They stick out a lot more, they pierce out a lot more, and they sound really good. And that along with something else, so the rhythm guitar, while I'm pretty sure it's doing the same movements as before, is doing something different. It's actually not doing power chords like it shows here. What I think it's actually doing rather is playing just palm muted eighth notes. So the roots here are correct. I don't think it's playing power chords, but aside from that, the rhythm is changing up too. The intervals, once again, are the same, but instead of doing something else or doing the chords it was doing like prior, the chords and palm mutations, it's only palm mutations. And again, this shows its chords. I think this tab is wrong in this section. So yeah. Very, very cool stuff there. A final thing to note in this section is how it starts. And that's the fact that this last part of the chorus before it turns into F sharp minor is actually cut off. And I'll play that so it's clear. I'm gonna play this right from the start. This is the first part of the last chorus. This is the section that's in D sharp minor. And let's listen to what happens right before, or rather right at the same time as it transitions into F sharp minor. Okay, so if you didn't catch it, like, it's all cool, because I'll tell you, what they essentially did there is they cut off 2 measures. Right here, after that section, there's usually 2 more measures of, like, chorus, you know what I'm saying? This chorus, instead of being the standard 8 and 16 measures, I believe it would be, I think it's only 14. So, but whatever it is, it cuts off 2 of the measures. So if the choruses in the past were 16 measures fully, this one is only 14. It cuts those off, and I'd be like, well, why did they do that? That's kind of weird. It's another thing to keep you engaged, to keep you moving, and it's all these little touches, man, because all these things by themselves you might never notice. And to be honest, if a single element, small element that we've talked about here occurred by itself in a song, it really wouldn't be that big of a deal at all. But the fact that all these little elements appear together, like the key changes, like the chorus getting cut off, the first part of the last chorus getting cut off, does things to move the song forward, does things to keep the song interesting and engaging, along with other things like changing up the drums every now and then, which is a pretty basic thing. We hear that all over the place. But all these things come together to make the song interesting. And even though they repeat the same motif, because that's basically what this is, that lead line is the motif of the entire song. It's repeated in the verses, in the choruses. It's repeated rhythmically, lower on the guitar neck, higher on the guitar neck. It's repeated in a lead fashion. Even though the motif is always the same, it still always sounds really fresh because of all these little techniques and tricks going on. So let's go ahead and just listen to this thing all the way through. The drums change here as well, of course. And that's it. The song ends rather abruptly, but man, what a sick journey it was to go on it. And that's the funny thing too, because when I first started listening to the song and when I decided to make this video, I didn't think there'd be like this much kind of interesting stuff going on to talk about, but it really is a great example of, outside of like the music theory from the standpoint of chord implications, there's lots of other tricks and techniques going on to make this thing sound interesting and cool and unique, and it just grabbing your attention like consistently. And there's several things here that we need to keep in mind. One of the things is the fact, use key changes, and if you have a hard time using a key change and making it sound good, try a different key change, like refer to the circle of fifths. All right. So the circle of fifths, it can be a guide, the closer on the circle of fifths that you are when you do a key change, the more coherent it'll sound and more consolidated and consistent it'll sound with what key you were in prior. Going from, say, C major to G major, and that's right here, the reds are the major, will sound way more consistent and put together than going from C to F sharp. That'll sound very, very jarring. So that'd be something to avoid if you wanted to sound consistent. Or if you wanted something to sound very jarring, perhaps go from, say, like D major to A flat. It all depends on what you want. Along with that, doing things like just lopping off a few measures here or there. Like most songs we listen to in metal and melodic death metal, they follow sort of a 8 or 16 or 32, however you want to say it, bar structure. If you want to create some intrigue and some interest, just cut off some of those bars like Omnium Gatherum did here. Like, it's almost like when the last chorus came up, when they're in the first key of the last chorus, it's almost like they couldn't wait to get to the last part of the chorus to show us what was coming because it sounds so amazing. So they didn't want to wait, so they just cut off 2 measures and they just went right to it and everything like that. And maybe that was a decision made once everything was already recorded. It could have been. Regardless, I think it was a great idea in order to keep things driving and to keep things moving and just to keep things interesting. Like, those touches more or less are kind of what you expect from listening to a lot of music like this without even knowing it. And so to know what touches they're doing enables us to be able to put things like that in our metal and in our music to make it sound interesting and, quite honestly, to make it sound professional and high quality, because this sort of stuff is happening on the regular, whether we hear it or not, And I think that's one of the best things you can like do as a band, is to use these tricks without making it like smack you in the face and thinking like, whoa, what's going on there? That was jarring. None of this is jarring. It all sounds great and good and on point, quite honestly. So a great application of professional musicianship, as well as, whatever techniques were done after the song was written to make it sound even better and to push it to that next level. So really good stuff right here. I love this song. Guys, if you like this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could check out one of my new songs. It's called Celestial Fray. It's on Spotify, Apple Music, all that good stuff right now. I'll go ahead and put a link up to it somewhere at the end of the video. You can find it on Spotify by typing in Spike's Signal, just like you see it here on YouTube. I have some other stuff that if you want to check that out as well, I'd appreciate it, but do your thing. Thank you for that. Thank you for watching. And if you want to see more like this, keep it right here at the Spike Signal. Thank you.